Welcome to Tales by Sombaby, where family secrets come to light, betrayal has consequences, and the people who are underestimated often have the strongest comeback. My name is Naomi, and I'm 27 years old. This story starts 9 years ago, on an afternoon that ended my childhood and began the hardest, and ultimately the most defining, chapter of my life. Stay with me until the end, because I promise you, the ending is worth it. I still remember the smell of my stepmother's kitchen that day, cinnamon candles burning on the counter, something in the oven for a dinner I wouldn't be invited to eat. My stepmother, Renata, stood in the doorway of my bedroom with her arms crossed, her voice calm in a way that somehow made it worse. "This isn't working anymore, Naomi. I think it's time you found somewhere else to stay." I was 16. My father, a staff sergeant, had been deployed overseas for 4 months by then, and I'd been living alone in that house with Renata and her 2 biological children, my half-siblings Devin and Priya, for most of that time. Renata had never hidden how she felt about me. Not really. The cold silences at dinner, the way she'd introduced Devin and Priya as my kids, and me as my husband's daughter from before. The birthday parties I wasn't invited to that were held in our own living room, while I sat in my bedroom listening through the wall. But I hadn't expected this. Not really. Not until I saw the black garbage bags already lined up by the front door, packed with my clothes, my school things, and one small box that held the only photograph I owned of my mother, who had died of cancer when I was 11. "This is Dad's house too," I said, my voice cracking in a way I hated. "Your father isn't here," Renata said, and for the first time, I saw something almost like satisfaction cross her face. "And when he gets back, we'll have a conversation about what's best for everyone. Right now, what's best is that you go stay with a friend, or a relative, or wherever 16-year-olds go. You have an hour." Devin and Priya, 13 and 11 at the time, sat on the living room couch watching a movie, completely unbothered, as I carried 3 garbage bags out to my beat-up Honda Civic, a car I'd bought myself the summer before with money from a part-time job, the one thing Renata hadn't managed to take from me. I sat in the driver's seat in our driveway for 20 minutes, waiting for someone, anyone, to come out and tell me this was a mistake, that she didn't really mean it, that I could come back inside. Nobody did. Eventually, I drove away, because staying parked outside a house that no longer wanted me felt like its own kind of humiliation. That first night, I parked behind an all-night diner on the edge of town and cried until I physically couldn't anymore. I want to tell you I had some brilliant plan, some safety net, some adult who swooped in immediately to fix everything. I didn't. What I had was a car, 3 garbage bags, $340 in a savings account, and a fierce, stubborn refusal to let Renata be right about me. The diner became my anchor point almost by accident. I started going in most mornings to use the bathroom to wash up before school, and that's how I met Odessa, the overnight waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver lokes and the kind of no-nonsense kindness that saves lives without ever making a big deal of it. "Baby, you've been coming in here looking like you slept in a car for a week," she said to me one morning, sliding a cup of coffee and a plate of toast across the counter, before I could even sit down. "I'm fine," I lied, the way you do when the truth feels too big to say out loud. She didn't push. She just kept sliding me free food every morning after that, waving off my attempts to pay, telling me to get on to school before I could argue. I want to be honest about what that 1.5 years was actually like, because I think it matters. I showered at the community recreation center before it opened for the public. I did my homework under the diner's fluorescent lights using their free Wi-Fi. I picked up shifts at a grocery store after school and cleaned offices on weekends. 3 jobs stacked on top of a full course load, because falling behind in school felt like the one thing I couldn't afford, literally or otherwise. My school counselor, Mrs. Alvarez, clearly suspected something was wrong. She'd ask gentle, probing questions I always found a way to deflect, terrified that if the school found out, they'd call child services, or worse, try to reach my father overseas, and somehow make things more complicated than they already were. Renata had kept me on the family phone plan, which I later understood wasn't kindness, it was control, a way to monitor who I talked to and maintain the appearance, to anyone checking in, that she was still looking after me. Her social media told a different story than my life did. Family beach trip with my babies. One caption read, underneath a photo of Devon and Priya, at a resort I'd never been allowed anywhere near. Blessed beyond measure, read another. I existed nowhere in any of it. As far as the internet was concerned, Renata had 2 children, not 3. By senior year, I was running on caffeine, stubbornness, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones. I ate a lot of instant ramen and gas station sandwiches. I wore the same handful of outfits in careful rotation, washing them in a laundromat sink when I couldn't afford the machines. I hadn't bought new shoes in almost a year. What made it hardest wasn't the hunger or the exhaustion, honestly. It was sitting in class listening to classmates complain about problems that felt, to me, like unimaginable luxuries. My parents are only giving me $200 for prom, one girl groaned in the seat behind me, and I remember staring at my textbook so hard the words blurred, because $200 was more than I'd spent on food in the last month combined. I kept my grades up anyway. Straight A's became a kind of quiet rebellion, my way of proving, to myself, mostly, that Renata's version of my future wasn't the only one available to me. My English teacher, Mr. Okafor, was the one who first mentioned the full-ride scholarship program at State University. Your essay is exceptional, Naomi, he told me, handing back a draft covered in careful notes. There's real resilience in this writing. Don't undersell what you've survived. I hadn't told him everything. I'd told him enough, vague enough to protect the parts of the story that still felt too raw to say out loud, specific enough that he understood I wasn't writing about hypothetical hardship. That scholarship became my way out. Full tuition, housing, a small stipend. For the first time in almost 2 years, I let myself imagine a version of my life that didn't involve sleeping in a car. College, when it finally came, felt like paradise compared to what I'd left behind. A real bed, a door that locked, a meal plan that meant I didn't have to calculate whether I could afford both groceries and gas in the same week. But college poverty is its own particular kind of hard, and I want to be honest about that too, instead of pretending the scholarship solved everything overnight. My dorm room was small. My roommate, Farah, was kind but had no framework for understanding why I never joined everyone for pizza runs or weekend trips, why I worked 2 jobs on top of a full course load, why I flinched slightly whenever anyone mentioned calling their parents for extra spending money. I tried, once, to reach my father through the military's family communication channels. Renata intercepted the message before it ever reached him. Her text to me the next day was short and cold. Try that again, and I'll make sure he doesn't want to see you when he gets back. I can be very convincing when I need to be. I believed her. My father had leaned on Renata heavily after my mother died, and I understood, even then, that she'd positioned herself as his lifeline during the worst period of his life. I was a reminder of everything that had come before her, and reminders like that are easy for some people to discard. It was around this time that I met Julian, a pre-med student in my chemistry study group, quiet and steady in a way that felt unfamiliar after years of chaos. He never pushed when I made excuses about not being able to afford the coffee shop meetups. He just started accidentally ordering too much food, sliding half of it across the table without comment, letting me keep whatever dignity I had left intact. Meanwhile, Renata's online presence exploded into something almost theatrical. She launched a parenting blog called Raising with Love, complete with a bio describing herself as devoted mother of two, and, further down, in smaller text, bonus stepmom to a wonderful young woman finding her own path. The audacity of that phrase, finding her own path, as if I'd chosen homelessness as a personal growth journey, made me physically ill the first time I read it. Junior year, in the middle of a late night studying at the library, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number with a military prefix. "Naomi? Baby girl, is that you?" My father's voice, rougher than I remembered, cracked through what sounded like a bad connection. I nearly dropped my phone right there in the library. "Dad." I stepped outside into the cold, my heart pounding. "Where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm stateside for a bit. Got injured. Nothing life-threatening. Don't worry. I'm at the medical center for a few weeks." A pause. "Renata told me you've been swamped with school, but I need to see you, sweetheart. Can you come?" My hands were shaking by the time I hung up. Renata hadn't told him anything about throwing me out. For nearly 3 years, she'd controlled every piece of communication between us, and my father had no idea any of it had happened. I drove to see him with a folder of evidence I'd been quietly assembling for longer than I want to admit. Screenshots of Renata's social media posts from the week she'd thrown me out. Photos I'd taken of myself in my car those first exhausted weeks. Pay stubs proving a 16-year-old had been working full-time hours while enrolled full-time in school, and a handful of voicemails Renata hadn't realized I'd saved, in which she'd called me a burden, a mistake her husband had made before she came along. When I walked into his hospital room, his face lit up in a way that nearly broke me all over again. "There she is. Renata's been showing me all your sorority photos. Look at you. Thriving. I'd never joined a sorority. I'd never had time. Dad, can we talk alone for a minute?" Renata's smile tightened instantly. "Oh, sweetie, your father's had such a long day. Maybe tomorrow would be." "Now," I said, quieter than I expected, steadier than I felt. Something in my voice made my father sit up straighter, made him study my face the way he used to when I was small, and he could always tell when something was wrong. "Renata, give us a few minutes," he said. She left, but not before shooting me a look I understood perfectly. This isn't over. I placed the folder in his lap without a word and watched, piece by piece, as my father's face changed. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like grief, and finally, something colder and harder than I'd ever seen on him before. "She told me you chose to live independently," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that you wanted space for college prep. She threw me out at 16, Dad. I lived in my car for almost 2 years. The folder slid off his lap onto the hospital bed. "What have I done?" he said, more to himself than to me. When Renata came back into the room 20 minutes later, still smiling that same practiced smile, she found my father sitting rigid, the evidence spread across his blanket like an indictment. "Everything all right in here?" she asked, though her eyes had already found the papers. "Sit down," my father said, and his voice had a flatness to it I'd never heard before, the voice I imagine he used giving orders overseas. What followed was a conversation I won't reproduce in full, because some of it isn't mine to share in detail. But I'll tell you this. Renata tried every angle. She tried tears. She tried claiming I'd exaggerated. She tried reminding him how hard it had been, raising a teenager who wasn't even hers, while managing 2 young children alone during his deployment. "She was your responsibility the moment you married me," my father said. "I trusted you with my daughter, and you threw her away like she was nothing." Security eventually had to escort her out of the hospital wing after she began threatening lawyers and custody arrangements that made no legal sense for a stepchild who was, by then, 20 years old. Devon and Priya, waiting in the hallway, followed their mother out without a word, without so much as looking at me. For the first time in nearly 3 years, I had my father back. The divorce moved quickly, once military legal counsel got involved. There's a particular kind of speed that comes with evidence of child abandonment and years of intercepted communication. My father was ordered to pay me back support directly, money that had technically been allocated for my care and never once reached me. "I want to try to fix this," he told me, sliding a check across a diner table not unlike the one I'd once called home. "I know it doesn't undo anything, but it's a start." It wasn't about the money, not really, though I won't pretend it didn't help. It was about hearing him say, finally and clearly, that none of it had been my fault. We spent the following months rebuilding what Renata had spent years dismantling. My father, it turned out, had been carrying his own weight of guilt since my mother's death. Guilt he'd buried in deployments and, eventually, in Renata's careful attention. Understanding that didn't erase what had happened to me, but it helped me understand how it had happened. I finished my degree with honors. Julian and I had been dating for over a year by then, and while he finished his pre-med requirements, I found myself drawn toward a master's program in family therapy, wanting, more than anything, to be the adult in the room for some other kid who needed one. "You want to help kids in situations like yours," Julian said one evening, watching me pore over graduate program brochures. "Someone should have been there for me," I said. "I'd like to be that for someone else." What I didn't know yet was that Julian's path was about to take a sharp, unexpected turn. He'd always loved theater on the side, a hobby squeezed in between organic chemistry and clinical rotations, and during our final year of undergrad, his older brother, already working as a talent manager, convinced him to audition for a small role in an independent film almost as a joke. The joke turned into a callback. The callback turned into a supporting role in a limited series that unexpectedly caught fire during award season. By the time I finished my master's degree, Julian was walking red carpets and getting recognized in grocery stores, all while somehow remaining, underneath it, exactly the same steady, quietly generous person who used to accidentally order too much food in a college coffee shop. "This is surreal," I told him after his first major magazine profile. "It's noise," he said, pulling me close in our small apartment. "You know who I actually am." He proposed in that same small kitchen, not at some glamorous event, but on an ordinary Tuesday, while I stood at the stove making a pot of ramen, the same cheap comfort food that had once been my only meal some weeks, now something I ate purely out of nostalgia. He got down on one knee beside our second-hand table and asked me to marry him with a ring that had been custom-made, using small stones from my late mother's jewelry, pieces my father had finally reclaimed from Renata's house during the divorce proceedings. I said yes before he even finished the question. Wedding planning, once Julian's career took off, became far more complicated than either of us wanted. His publicist pushed for a large, photographed event. We pushed back, insisting on something intimate, close family, close friends, nothing performative. "What about your stepfamily?" Julian asked one evening as we worked through the guest list. I hadn't spoken to Renata, Devon, or Priya in over 5 years by that point. My father occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances. Renata had remarried another deployed service member within a year of the divorce, following what I can only assume was a well-practiced playbook. "They're not on the list," I said simply. They were never really family to begin with. What we didn't anticipate was that Renata had been watching from a distance, closer than we realized. My friend Tasha showed me the proof over lunch one afternoon, practically shoving her phone across the table. "You need to see what your stepmother's been posting." Renata's social media had transformed, almost overnight, into a shrine to Julian's career. Every red carpet photo, every interview, every mention of his engagement had been shared, commented on, celebrated. "So proud of my stepdaughter and her incredible fiancé," one caption read. I always knew she had something special in her. There were dozens of posts like it, each one rewriting our shared history a little more dramatically than the last. According to Renata's version of events, she'd been a supportive, loving stepmother all along, practically responsible for whatever success I'd found. "She's telling people she's coming to the wedding," Tasha said. "She's been commenting on Julian's fan accounts, calling herself his future mother-in-law." My stomach turned. She thinks 8 years just didn't happen. Apparently, and there's more. Tasha hesitated. "She's been calling venues and vendors, claiming to be your mother, trying to get details about the wedding." It got stranger still. Renata had somehow learned that Julian's older brother, the one who'd first pushed him toward acting, was getting married the same weekend we were, at a venue not far from our own, with significant overlap in guests. It was, for her, apparently, the perfect opportunity to insert herself into our world under the guise of a proud, doting stepmother, in front of exactly the kind of audience that would never know any better. "We should warn them," I said. Julian shook his head slowly. "Let her show everyone exactly who she is. We don't have to say a word." Julian's brother's wedding was, by any measure, beautiful. An elegant sunset ceremony at a country club, 200 guests, a handful of industry names mixed in among family and old friends. I wore something simple, navy, understated, since this wasn't my day to shine, and then Renata walked in. She'd somehow talked her way past the guest list, dressed in a gown that likely cost more than my old Honda Civic, dripping in jewelry, Devon and Priya trailing behind her like an entourage. They looked older now, harder around the edges in a way that comes from a life built carefully around appearances rather than substance. "Is that?" the woman next to me whispered. "My former stepmother," I said quietly, watching her work the room with practiced charm, already gathering a small crowd of guests who had no idea what they were listening to. She was telling anyone who'd listen about her daughter, about how proud she was, about the sacrifices she'd made raising me. Within minutes, she had genuine warmth radiating off strangers who believed every word. "She's actually good at this," Julian murmured beside me, squeezing my hand. "That's exactly how she's gotten away with it for this long," I said. Then Renata spotted us. Her face lit up with what looked, to anyone watching, like genuine joy, and she glided across the room with her arms already opening for an embrace. "Naomi, my beautiful girl, you look absolutely radiant." Her eyes moved to Julian. "And you, even more handsome in person than the magazines." Several nearby guests had already turned to watch, sensing a heartwarming family reunion. A couple of them had their phones half raised, ready to capture the moment. "Hello, Renata," I said, making no move to accept the hug. Her smile flickered, just slightly, before she recovered it. "I've missed you so much, sweetheart. We have so much catching up to do. I have wonderful stories about you growing up." "Do you?" I said. "Because I have a few stories too." Julian's hand tightened gently around mine, steady, grounding. "Like the one where you handed me 3 garbage bags at 16 and told me I wasn't your real daughter." Renata laughed, a thin, nervous sound. "Oh, sweetie, that's not quite how it happened. Or the one where I lived in my car for almost 2 years, while you posted online about being Mother of the Year." The small crowd that had gathered around her charm offensive had gone completely silent. A few more phones came up, but not to capture a reunion this time. "Naomi, please," Renata said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "People are watching." "They should watch," I said, my own voice steady, carrying further than I intended. "The same way people watched you throw a 16-year-old out of her own home. The same way you watched me struggle for years while pretending online that I didn't exist, right up until my life became something worth attaching yourself to." Her face had gone pale beneath her makeup. "You have no idea what kind of pressure I was under. A teenager in the house, your father overseas." "She was a child," Julian said quietly, but with a firmness that made several nearby guests turn toward him. Your child, technically, whether you claimed her or not. The color had fully drained from Renata's face by then. Whatever composure she'd walked in with was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that the audience she'd built her entire performance for had just watched the curtain fall on its own. She reached out, unsteady, gripping the back of a nearby chair, and for a moment I genuinely thought she might faint right there on the dance floor. Her breathing had gone shallow, her hand trembling against the fabric. A staff member rushed over with a chair and a glass of water. Someone else quietly suggested she sit down and catch her breath before anything more serious happened. I didn't feel triumphant watching that. I felt, mostly, done. Done carrying a story that had never been mine to be ashamed of. Done letting someone else's version of events define who I was in rooms full of people who didn't know any better. Renata left the reception not long after, quietly, without the graceful exit she'd clearly imagined for herself walking in. Devon and Priya followed her out, and I never saw any of them again, not even at our own wedding 2 days later, which unfolded exactly the way we'd wanted it to. Small, warm, and entirely free of anyone who'd spent years pretending I didn't exist until it became convenient to claim me. My father walked me down the aisle. Miss Odessa, the waitress who'd fed me free breakfast for 2 years without ever asking for anything in return, sat in the second row, crying happy tears through the entire ceremony. Mr. Okafor, my old English teacher, sent a card that arrived a week later with a single line inside. I always knew there was more to your story than you let me see. I'm glad you got to write the ending yourself. That's the thing I want to leave you with today. I didn't get here by destroying anyone. I didn't need to. Renata's carefully constructed version of herself collapsed under its own weight the moment it met the truth in a room full of witnesses. All I had to do was stop protecting a story that had never protected me. If you've ever been thrown away by someone who was supposed to love you, I hope you hear this clearly. Surviving it is not the same as being broken by it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep going long enough to watch the truth catch up with the people who tried to bury it. Thank you for listening to my story today. If this story moved you, and if you believe that the people who count us out are often the ones most surprised by how far we go anyway, Tales by Sombaby has more stories like this one waiting for you.